I signed my name on the wrong line. That was what my daughter-in-law said when she handed me the paper a second time, pointing to a dotted line near the bottom of the page with her finger, smiling the way she always smiled, lips closed, head tilted slightly, like she was being patient with a child. My son was standing near the window with his back to me, looking out at the yard I had mowed myself just 3 days before. Neither of them knew I had already read every word on that document twice before they walked through my front door. I picked up the pen. I signed on the wrong line again. She took a small breath. I heard it. My son turned around. I set the pen down on the kitchen table and folded my hands and looked out past both of them at the bird feeder I had built from cedar planks the summer my wife was still alive. A cardinal sat on the edge of it, red as a warning. I said nothing. I let them exchange a look over my head the way they had been doing for months, and I kept my face empty and soft, the way a man looks when he has forgotten how to follow a conversation. I had not forgotten anything. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a civil engineer before I retired. I paid off this house before my son finished high school, and I have never in my life needed anyone to manage my affairs. My wife, Carol, passed 4 years ago, from a stroke that came without warning on a Tuesday morning in April. After the funeral, after the flowers died and the casserole dishes were returned and the sympathy cards stopped coming, I learned how to live alone. It took time, but I learned. My son moved back to this state about 2 years ago. He had been living in Phoenix with his wife, my daughter-in-law, and they had been, by his own account, doing well. He had a position at a logistics company. She did something in marketing she described differently every time I asked. Then one weekend they arrived at my door with 2 suitcases and a story about a company restructuring and an apartment lease. They had let expire just a little too early, and my son looked at me with the same eyes he had at 9 years old, when he had broken a lamp, throwing a baseball inside the house. And I said they could stay in the guest room until they got back on their feet. That was 22 months ago. In the first few months I told myself it was temporary. I cooked. I kept to my schedule. I let my daughter-in-law redecorate the guest room because she said it helped her feel settled, and I watched her carry my wife's spare quilt to the garage without asking, and I said nothing. My son paid no rent because he said they were saving to put a deposit on a new place. I did not press. He was my son. By month 6, my daughter-in-law had begun referring to the house as our place in conversations I was not supposed to overhear. She said it on the phone once, standing in the hallway outside the kitchen. Yeah, at our place. It's got a big backyard, 2.5 baths. I stood at the stove and stirred my coffee and let it pass. By month 9, my son had added himself as an authorized user on one of my credit cards. He said it was easier for errands. He did not ask. He mentioned it after the fact, casual, the way you mentioned changing a light bulb. I canceled the card the next morning and told the bank it had been lost. The document they brought me that afternoon was a durable power of attorney. I had seen enough of them in my life to recognize the language in the first paragraph. It would give my son authority over my financial and medical decisions in the event that I became, and this was the phrase used, unable to manage my own affairs. There was a section about property. There was a section about investment accounts. There was a signature line for a notary, which meant they had already arranged for someone to come and witness it. I did not let them see that I recognized it. I squinted at it the way an old man squints when the print is small. I asked my son what it said in a vague and distracted way, and he said it was just a standard planning document, something everyone should have. He had read about it online. It was for my protection. I nodded slowly. I signed on the wrong line the second time. My daughter-in-law picked up the papers and said she would have them looked at and maybe they would try again another day. She was careful not to sound frustrated. She patted my hand once, quickly, and I looked at the cardinal out the window and said it was a pretty bird. After they went upstairs, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I got up, went to my office, locked the door, and called a man named George. George and I had been friends for 40 years. We had met at a firm where we both worked in our 30s. He as an attorney handling estate law, me as an engineer on contract. We had stayed in touch through decades of holiday cards and occasional lunches and one memorable fishing trip in Montana that neither of us talked about much. When Carol died, George had driven 4 hours to attend the funeral and stood in the back of the church and did not say much, but stayed until the very end. I told him everything. The document, the credit card, the 22 months, the look my son and my daughter-in-law exchanged when they thought I was not paying attention. George was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long have you been noticing this?" I said, "About 6 months of real noticing, and maybe a year of a feeling I had been pushing away." He said, "Okay, here is what you are going to do." I listened. I took notes in the small leather notebook I kept in my desk drawer. When he was finished, I said I had one more thing to tell him, something I had not told anyone. I told him about the night 3 weeks before, when I had come downstairs at 2 in the morning for a glass of water and seen light under the door of my home office. I had stood in the hallway in my socks and listened, and I had heard my daughter-in-law's voice, low and careful, reading numbers aloud. Account numbers. My account numbers. I knew because I had stared at those numbers on paper every month for years. George did not say anything for several seconds. Then he said, "Don't touch anything, don't move anything, and do not sign a single piece of paper until you talk to me first." I said I understood. He said, "And Walter, keep being forgetful." My son had always been a gentle child. That is the thing that stayed with me through all of it, not the anger, not the sense of betrayal, but the memory of who he had been before. He used to fall asleep in the car on long drives, and I would carry him inside without waking him, his head against my shoulder, his breath warm on my neck. He had been kind to animals and patient with his younger cousins, and he had written me a card on Father's Day when he was 12 that I still had in a box in my closet. I did not know at what point in his life my son had stopped being that person, or whether my daughter-in-law had drawn something out of him that had always been there beneath the surface, waiting. I did not spend much time on the question. What I knew was what I was watching now, and what I was watching was the two of them treating my home like an inheritance that had not yet been transferred. After the document incident, I began paying closer attention to the small things. I had always been a methodical man. 31 years of engineering had made me precise in the way I observed the world. I began keeping notes in the leather notebook. Not dramatic things. Small things. Dates and times and what was said. The morning my daughter-in-law asked me if I remembered where I had put my car keys when they were on the hook by the door where I always kept them. The afternoon my son told me I had already told him a story I was in the middle of telling, which was not true. The way they had begun finishing my sentences for me, in front of the neighbor who sometimes came over for coffee, slowly building a portrait of a man whose mind was slipping. I started leaving my car keys in slightly different places each morning. I wanted to see if she would move them. She moved them twice in 1 week. I found them once in a kitchen drawer and once in the coat closet. Each time I came to her with a slightly confused look and said, "Have you seen my keys? I can't seem to remember where I put them." She would find them for me, and there was something in her face in that moment, not quite satisfaction, but close to it that I filed away and did not forget. George told me I needed documentation, not just my own notes, but recorded evidence where the law permitted it, and he told me which state I was in and what the rules were. He told me to be careful and methodical and not to show my hand. I bought a small digital voice recorder at an electronics store 3 towns over, paying in cash. I am not a man who normally thinks in terms of surveillance. I had spent my career designing bridges and drainage systems and flood control infrastructure. I believed in honesty and directness. But I had also spent 67 years learning that honesty requires the other party to be operating in good faith, and I was no longer confident that was the case in my own home. I placed the recorder in the kitchen on the morning my son told me he had made an appointment for me with a doctor. He said it casually at breakfast, not asking, informing. He said the doctor was a specialist, someone who could do a general assessment, make sure everything was functioning well. He said it was just a checkup. I asked what kind of specialist. He said a cognitive specialist. I nodded slowly and said that sounded fine, and I stared at my eggs. That night I called George and told him. He was quiet again, and then he said, "That's the next step." He explained what it meant. If a doctor, the right kind of doctor, one who had been spoken to in advance, one who was perhaps willing to write a certain kind of report, found that I showed signs of cognitive decline, that report could be used to support a petition for guardianship. It would no longer be a voluntary power of attorney. It would be a legal declaration. A judge could strip me of the right to manage my own affairs based on a physician's evaluation. I sat in my office with the door locked and thought about that for a long time. George told me what to do. I wrote it down. The appointment was on a Wednesday. My son drove me. My daughter-in-law stayed home, and when we left I saw her at the window watching the car pull out of the driveway. The office was in a medical building I did not recognize, not affiliated with my regular physician, not affiliated with the hospital where I had gone for 20 years. The waiting room had 3 chairs and a receptionist who did not make eye contact. The doctor was a small man with very clean hands and a way of speaking that reminded me of a man reading from a script. He asked me to count backward from 100 by 7s. I did it perfectly. He asked me to remember 3 words: apple, honesty, silver, and then asked me to recall them 10 minutes later after a series of other questions. I recalled all 3. He asked me to draw a clock set to 10 past 11. I drew it correctly. He did not seem pleased. He asked me to describe my daily routine, and I described it in detail, including the names of the 2 books I was currently reading, the time I woke up, the medications I took, and their dosages. He wrote things on his notepad. After 40 minutes, he said he would send his report to my son, and I thanked him and shook his clean hand. In the car on the way home, my son said, "How do you feel? Do you feel okay?" I said I felt a little tired and looked out the window. 2 days later, George told me he had looked up the doctor's medical license. It was current. But the doctor's name appeared in a lawsuit from 4 years prior, a civil case involving a nursing facility in which the doctor had provided evaluations used to establish guardianship over several patients who later contested the findings. The case had been settled out of court. George had the case number. He had a friend who had pulled the documents. I went to the cabinet in the kitchen, where I kept a bottle of bourbon I had been given as a retirement gift and had never opened, and I poured 2 fingers and sat at the table and drank it slowly. Then I put the glass in the sink and went back to work. I want to be honest about something. There were moments during those weeks when I questioned myself. Not my sanity, I was never confused about that, but my judgment about my son. I would be sitting across from him at dinner, watching him eat, and I would think about the boy he had been, and I would wonder whether I had misread the situation, whether there was an innocent explanation, whether the grief of losing his mother had bent him sideways in ways I did not fully understand and had not properly tried to address. Then I would think about my wife's quilt in the garage. I would think about the account numbers read aloud in the dark. I would think about the doctor with the clean hands, and I would pick up my fork and eat my dinner and keep my face soft. My daughter-in-law began making comments about the stairs. She said she worried about me on the stairs, that older men had falls, that it might be worth thinking about whether this house was the right configuration for my current situation. She said the phrase "current situation" twice in 1 week. I wrote it down. She also began taking an interest in the painting in the dining room, a landscape Carol had bought at an art fair in Vermont the year we got married. She asked once whether it was valuable, keeping her voice light and curious, and I said I had no idea. It had just been something my wife had liked. She nodded and looked at it a moment longer than necessary. I knew the painting. I had seen it every day for 40 years. I could close my eyes and see every brushstroke. The fact that someone was now looking at it as an asset to be assessed made me feel something I did not have a name for. Not anger exactly, something colder and quieter. The recorder in the kitchen caught 2 significant conversations. The first was a Sunday morning when I had told them I was going to walk to the end of the block and back, which I did for my circulation, and I came back early because the weather turned and let myself in quietly through the side door. My son and daughter-in-law were in the kitchen. She was saying, in a voice I had not heard her use before, flat and businesslike, that the process was taking too long, that the appointment had not produced what they needed, that the doctor's report was going to require a follow-up evaluation, and she did not want to wait for a follow-up evaluation because she had done the research, and a second evaluation meant more time, and more time meant more risk. She said the word risk, the way you say it about a deadline. My son said he thought they needed to be careful. She said they had been careful for almost 2 years, and careful was not getting them anywhere. He said he did not want to do anything that could come back on them. She said, in a voice that was very quiet and very clear, that if they waited much longer, the estate would have to go through probate, and probate meant lawyers and courts and delays and scrutiny, and that was the one thing they could not afford given the situation with the financing. I did not know about a situation with the financing. I stood outside the side door in the cold for a moment, then let myself back out and walked around to the front and came in the front door, making enough noise that they would hear me. The second conversation was 3 days later. I had placed the recorder on the highest shelf in the kitchen pantry, behind a box of oatmeal. My daughter-in-law was on the phone with someone, a man, based on her end of the conversation, and she was discussing a timeline. She used the word facility twice. She said my name once. She said the phrase, once it's established. She said very clearly that the house had been appraised recently at a number that made the whole thing worth doing properly. She had appraised my house without telling me. I stood in the hallway and let the recorder run. I called George that evening and told him about both conversations. I read him my notes from the last 6 weeks. He listened without interrupting. When I was finished, he said, "Okay, I think it's time to move." He told me what he needed. I drove to his office the following Thursday while my son and daughter-in-law were both out. She had her regular Thursday lunch with a friend. My son worked part-time at a shipping warehouse he had found 3 months ago. I left at 9 in the morning and told them the night before I had a dentist appointment. At George's office, I signed documents of my own. A new will, one that replaced the previous version, and which had been drafted with considerable specificity. A revocable living trust, properly structured. A genuine, durable power of attorney, designating George himself as my agent, executed correctly, witnessed and notarized in a manner that would withstand any challenge. A letter to my bank removing my son as an authorized user on any account and flagging the accounts for additional security review. George also had a colleague who handled elder law litigation. She had reviewed the recordings I had sent him and the notes from the appointment with the doctor, and she said what we had was not yet a criminal matter, but it was moving in that direction, and the documentation was strong. I asked George what I should do when I got home. He said, "Act like nothing has changed. 1 more week." I drove home and made a sandwich and watched the cardinal at the bird feeder. My son found the new lock on my office door the following Saturday. I had installed it on a weekday morning while they were both out, a simple keyed lock, the kind you could buy at any hardware store. He asked me about it in the kitchen, and I said I had been having trouble with the latch, that it stuck sometimes, and I had replaced the hardware. I fumbled with my words slightly. He looked at the lock, and then at me, and nodded once, and walked away. My daughter-in-law was in the backyard on her phone that afternoon for a long time. I could see her through the kitchen window, walking back and forth in the dead grass along the fence line, speaking in a low voice, with one hand pressed flat against her sternum, the way she held herself when she was tense. That evening she was warm at dinner. She asked about my week, about how I was sleeping, whether the new pillow she had bought for the guest room she had recently suggested I might be more comfortable in the guest room, with its lower bed frame, had helped my back any. She poured my water without being asked. She laughed at something my son said. She was performing comfort, and I let her perform it and said my back was feeling a little better. Thank you. I washed my own dishes and went to bed and lay in the dark with my eyes open for a while, thinking about Carol. I thought about the summer we drove to Maine with my son when he was 7, and how he had collected so many rocks from the beach that Carol's tote bag had torn at the strap, and we had stood in a parking lot in the rain holding the torn strap and laughing until we couldn't breathe. I thought about who that boy had been. I thought about whether that boy was still somewhere inside the man downstairs. I decided it did not matter. What mattered was what the man downstairs had done and what he was planning to do. I went to sleep. George called on Monday morning. He told me the colleague had filed a protective petition with the court to preempt any guardianship proceeding. He told me a letter had gone to the medical board regarding the doctor. He told me a certified letter had been sent to my home address, and that I would need to be present to receive it, and I should be careful not to let my son or daughter-in-law receive it on my behalf. I made sure to be near the door on Tuesday when the postal carrier came. My daughter-in-law was in the kitchen when I signed for the letter. She asked what it was. I looked at the envelope and said it looked like something from my insurance company. I was always getting things from them. She paused just a half second too long and then went back to her coffee. I took the envelope to my office and locked the door. It was a copy of the protective petition filing, and there was a second envelope from George's office with a cover letter and a document I was supposed to read and keep. I read it twice. Then I sat quietly for a moment. Then I made a phone call to my son's cell phone and asked him if he could come home a little early because I wanted to talk to both of them about something. He asked what it was about. I said I had been thinking about the future and I wanted to discuss some things while I was feeling clear. He said he would be home by 4. I made coffee. I set 3 cups on the kitchen table. I sat down and waited. They came in together, which told me she had called him after I hung up, which told me they were coordinating, which I already knew. My daughter-in-law was wearing the bright smile she used when she wanted to seem relaxed. My son sat down and wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and looked at the table. I said I wanted to talk about the house. I saw them both sit slightly straighter. I said I knew they had been worried about me. I said I appreciated that they cared. I said that getting older was strange, that sometimes you felt like yourself, and sometimes you weren't sure, and that I had been thinking about what was best for everyone. My daughter-in-law said, of course, that was completely understandable, and that they only wanted what was best for me. I said I had made some decisions about my estate. My son looked up. I said I had spoken with an attorney. I said his name, George's name. I watched my son's face. I said I had updated my will and established a trust, and that the details were all in order, and that the attorney had a full copy of everything and would be managing my affairs going forward as my designated agent. My daughter-in-law set her coffee cup down very carefully. I said I also wanted to let them know that I was aware of the appointment with the cognitive specialist, and that I had requested a copy of the doctor's report, and that my attorney was reviewing it, along with some other materials he had found regarding the doctor's history. My son said very quietly, "Dad." I said I wasn't finished. He stopped. I said I knew about the appraisal. I said I knew about the conversations in the kitchen. I said I knew about the account numbers, though I did not specify how I knew, and I watched her face lose its structure for just a moment before she reassembled it. I said I was not angry. I said that was true. I had spent 6 weeks being angry in private, so that I would not have to be angry here. What I felt now was something closer to tired and something closer to sad, and beneath both of those things, something I could only call resolve. I told them they had 2 weeks to find other arrangements. My son said, "We have nowhere to go." I said that was a problem he would need to solve. I said I had been solving my own problems my whole life. I said his mother and I had worked for everything in this house, and I intended to remain in it for however many years I had left, and I intended to do that with my name on my own accounts and my keys on my own hook by the door. My daughter-in-law stood up. She said I was making a mistake, that they had only been trying to help, that I was confused about what the documents meant. I said her name, just once, quietly. She stopped. I said I had recordings of 2 conversations. I said my attorney had copies. I said the recordings, combined with the medical board filing and the documentation my attorney had compiled, were enough to support a legal proceeding if one became necessary. I said I very much hoped one would not become necessary, because legal proceedings were expensive and exhausting, and I was 67 years old, and I would rather spend my remaining energy on other things. But I said I was prepared. The kitchen was very quiet. My son was looking at the table. He would not look at me. His jaw was tight, and his shoulders were high, and he looked, in that moment, not like a man who had been caught, but like a boy who had done something he could not undo and knew it. I felt something move through me then that I did not expect, not forgiveness. I was not there yet, maybe I never would be, but something like grief. The grief of a door closing, the grief of understanding that some things, once done, leave marks that do not go away. My daughter-in-law picked up her purse from the chair and walked out of the kitchen without speaking. My son sat there for another few minutes without moving. Then he said very quietly, "I don't know how it got this far." I said I didn't either. He stood up. He did not look at me. He walked out of the kitchen and up the stairs, and I heard them moving around up there, the sound of drawers and footsteps and low voices I could not make out, and I sat at the kitchen table and drank my coffee, which had gone cold, and looked out the window at the bird feeder. They left 9 days later, not 2 weeks. My daughter-in-law's sister lived in a suburb about 40 minutes away and apparently had a room available. My son carried boxes to the car in 4 trips. I was in the garden the second time he came down the front steps, and we looked at each other across the driveway. He put the box in the trunk. He stood there for a moment. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I looked at him for a long time. He met my eyes for most of it. which took something from him, I could tell. I said, "I know." He nodded. He got in the car. My daughter-in-law did not come to say goodbye. I stood in the driveway until the car turned at the end of the block and was gone. Then I went inside. George's colleague filed the formal complaints with the medical board, and they were under investigation within the month. The doctor voluntarily surrendered his evaluation practice for elder patients pending review, which George said was as close to an admission as you usually got without a trial. There was a brief letter from my son's attorney, he had retained one, making some preliminary noises about contesting the new will on the grounds of undue influence from George. George responded with a summary of the recordings and the documentation, and the letter went away and did not come back. My son called me twice in the 3 months that followed. The first call was short and uncomfortable. He asked how I was. I said fine. He said he had gotten a better job, full-time, benefits. I said that was good. We talked about the weather for a moment, and then the call ended. The second call was longer. He said my daughter-in-law had moved out of her sister's place and was back in Phoenix. He said it in a flat voice that did not invite questions. I asked if he was all right. He said he was managing. He asked if he could come by sometime. I said I would think about it. I am still thinking about it. I do not know yet whether I will get to a place where I can sit across from my son in my own kitchen and drink coffee and have a normal conversation. I know that people are capable of terrible things out of desperation and fear, and the influence of someone who points their worst impulses in a particular direction. I know that I loved my son for a long time before any of this happened, and that love does not simply stop because it has been hurt. I also know that what he allowed to happen in my home, under my roof, was not a small thing. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a choice made again and again over the course of months. I think about Carol sometimes and what she would say. She was more forgiving than me by nature. She could hold anger and love at the same time without the two canceling each other out, which was a skill I always admired and never fully learned. I think she would tell me to be patient. I think she would tell me not to close a door I might want open later. I am trying to listen to her. It takes time. Last week I got the bird feeder down from its post and repainted it. The cedar had been weathering for 4 years, and it needed a coat of sealant. I sanded it in the garage on a cold morning with the radio on low, the grit of the sandpaper under my fingers, the smell of old wood and cut air. I took my time. There was no one to rush me. There was no one watching me from the window to catalog whether I seemed confused or uncertain or diminished in some way. It was just me and the wood, and the quiet of the garage. I finished it in the afternoon and let it dry overnight, and put it back on the post the following morning. The cardinal came back before noon. I watched it from the kitchen window for a while, just standing there with my coffee going warm in my hands. I am 67 years old. I paid off this house before my son finished high school. I know where my car keys are. I know the balance of every account I hold. I know the name of the medication I take each morning, and the name of the doctor who prescribed it, and the date of my last appointment, and the date of the next one. I know exactly who I am, and I have decided that is enough, more than enough, to build the rest of my life on. I set my coffee cup in the sink, and walked outside into the cold morning air, and I stood in my own yard, on my own ground, and I looked up at the sky for a long time. Then I went back inside and got to work.